Alright, hello everyone and welcome to this video here. In this video I have a special guest for you guys. We're going to be talking with one of my students. His name is Bill. He is rated 1642 USCF, and we're going to be taking a look at a game that he played in a recent tournament where he played against an opponent who was rated 1963, so about 300 about 300 points higher rated. But he played a really great game. He did use some of the recommendations that I make in one of my Chessable courses focusing on the Binko Gambit. And we're going to take a look at the game, see what he did really well, and we'll also have some instructive moments as things go on, and we'll be talking about it. So, nice to see you here, Bill. Give me a little bit of a quick synopsis of the game here and how I felt playing it.
Hey, Dalton, thanks. So, hey, everybody. My name's Bill. So, I've been a student of Dalton's for a little bit, just trying to improve. Came across him when I got his Binko Gambit course on Chessable. And so, as I was going into this tournament match, I was playing up a section. So, I was playing what they call their premier level. And so, out of about 32 people, I was the second lowest rated at 1642. I started off the first round. I was black, playing a opponent who was 1963, feeling a bit nervous because there's such a large gap there. But I had been prepping for how to play against the London, and I had a previous tournament where I'd gotten to use some of, the stuff that I learned through Dalton's course. And so as we went into this, my opponent, he started off playing the London with, d4, he brought his bishop out, and then I got pretty excited by how it went. So I felt like Dalton, I played really well in this match until the end when I got in the time scramble, got a little bit of trouble, but my opponent flagged, so fortunately pulled it out. But I gotta say, I just really want to thank you, Dalton, because your course is what really set me up for success on this, because when I ran this through the Lee Chess database, when I was doing the analysis on my own, I think by about move 10 or 11, we were in completely new territory. And I was set up for success where my opponent was always reacting to me. So, yeah, I was pretty excited about it. I'm looking forward to going over it with you.
Yeah, that's great. Very welcome to be able to help out with the opening side of things for sure. So yeah, as Bill mentioned here, it was a London system, and after our opponent plays d4, knight f6, white goes for bishop to f4. The recommendation I make in this course and the move that Bill played here was pawn to c5. And as Bill mentioned, typically what kind of happens in the game, well, usually, maybe not this game specifically, but most players go for the move e3 or c3. E3 especially is the main line that most of your opponents will face if you're playing this repertoire. But in this particular game, his opponent goes for the move pawn to d5, which is a bit of a more rare option. It is one of the better options for white, objectively, according to the computer evaluation, but it is already putting white into a slightly lesser known waters, kind of, as Bill mentioned, there's less games in the database, much less popular move than e3. And then especially after the next move here that he played, pawn to b5, gaining some space on the queen side, looking to discourage white from playing moves like pawn to c4, or at least keeping a little bit of control over there. Already white is in a very unfamiliar territory, even if they already knew about the move d5 themselves. b5 is very uncommon here, but a good move that black can play to go for. So as the game progresses, the main line, let's say, for white, or the best move for them, is to play the move pawn to e4. And after something like knight takes e4, white cannot take the pawn on b5 because we'll have a check on a5. The, let's say, computer recommended way of playing things is queen f3. We give a check, knight blocks, stuff gets traded, and ultimately black does end up being ahead of pawn, but white has a lot of compensation. So it's a pretty balanced-ish position here that is fine for both players. But instead,
Dalton, I just gotta say real quick to interrupt. I would be amazed to find somebody find that
right
below a master level. I mean, that's just crazy.
Yeah, especially if white's hit by this b5 move and not really aware of it, then the likelihood of them finding e4 and doing this pawn sacrifice, like, even if they found e4 and thought about the pawn sacrifice, they have to kind of pull the trigger on it anyways. So this opponent didn't do that. He went for the move c4, c4 in this position. And yeah, what the recommendation I give in the course, and also what Bill played here, is the move pawn to b4. And so we did discuss this a little bit in the past in terms of this type of pawn structure, but kind of what's your knowledge of this pawn structure here, Bill, once we've got the pawn on b4?
So I'm thinking kind of the whole, like, this is kind of like what you always say. This goes along with our Bingo Gambit repertoire. Number one, I'm grabbing space, and the way I'm looking at this is that I want to play d6 because I know white wants to play, e4, and then I'm looking at how I can play a5 and potentially get an a4 in, and maybe neutralize any play over there, but grab more space, and then see what's going on the king side. So I was feeling very good at this point by that. I did consider taking the pawn because I was like trying to remember, and I was like, no, I think I got to push here. And I'm glad I did, because I think, that pawn came in very handy later in the game.
Yeah, the pawn on b4 ends up being an MVP later on for sure. If we do take the pawn on c4, the drawback here is white can play the move knight c3, and then they get to play e4. They probably win the pawn back on c4, and we have a little bit less control of the position. It's not necessarily super bad for black, but playing pawn to b4 is a stronger option here. And so the setup that we'll see Bill goes for in the game, he goes for d6, as he mentioned. Later on down the road, a5, fianchettoing the bishop to the g7 square. And one of the biggest drawbacks that we'll see for white based on the arrangement of their pieces. So let's fast forward a few moves. White goes knight to d2 to prepare the move e4, d6, e4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7. And one of the drawbacks for white in this setup, especially when the bishop is already on the f4 square, is that there's already threats of knight h5, where we would be attacking the bishop on f4 and the pawn on b2 at the same time. And so this is already something that white has to be a little bit careful about. And your opponent went for a really surprising move here. He went for this move, queen a4 check. And what were you kind of thinking once this appeared on the board?
I was really surprised by it, because I just felt like it was a wasted move. I played bishop to d7. I'm going to chase the queen back. I could have played with the knight. I had a friend tonight ask me why I didn't play with the knight, and I said, well, I want to push the queen back. I don't want the queen to stay there. The only thing I could think that maybe he was thinking is he was limiting my knight's, options by getting my bishop on d7, because I just didn't really think it was a good move.
Yeah, so I do think the same thing you just said there. Maybe he's wanting to kind of pull our bishop to the d7 square so that our knights cannot use the d7 square. But it also costs white a move in the meantime, because they have to move the queen a second time after we play bishop d7. And we can always move the bishop off of d7 later anyways. We can play bishop g4 or bishop back to c8 if we really need to, and open up the d7 square for our knight to go to. And, we might move the bishop a second time, but they've already moved the queen a second time. Kind of cancels out a little bit in a situation like this. So we follow through with castling. White goes for the move h3. And then here we have a very interesting moment where Bill goes for the move e5, which is a good option in this position. A lot of people who are maybe seeing this type of pawn structure for the first time might be kind of surprised that we're playing e5, especially because it seems like we're blocking in the bishop on g7. And we also do give white the option of capturing en passant if they wanted to. But if white does capture en passant, first of all, just to note, we can recapture with the bishop, make sure that our pawn on d6 is defended. And it's a very interesting pawn structure in the sense that there are two different weak squares for each player. White has a weak square on d4, black has a weak square on d5. But one of the biggest reasons that this is a better position for black is mainly the access to each of these squares. So it's actually quite difficult for white to make use of the d5 square. He would need to get a knight to the e3 square to hop into d5. He can't go to c3 anymore with the knight because of our pawn on b4, which we put there earlier in the game. Conversely, we can get a knight to the d4 square very quickly, and we've also got a fair amount of control over the center. Maybe rook e8 pokes at the e4 pawn. So all that being said, white did not capture en passant, and he played the move bishop h2 instead. Now, once we get this kind of pawn structure, what was your thinking process at this point, Bill?
So I remembered in your course where you had talked about this, and what we're going to transition to is, King's Indian Defense, which I had played once upon a time, so I was familiar with. But before we do that, we want to try to push in, A5 and A4 because obviously when we're playing in a kid, anybody who's done it, White's always trying to counterattack on the queen side. So the idea is we want to limit White's ability to do that, grab more space, limit it, and then we're going to play the King's Indian Defense. We're going to attack on the king side. I think something I just want to add here, I think it's genius on your part that you came up with that, but I felt like my opponent just didn't know what to do, like when we were playing. He was limited. I've gone over the game with a few other friends, and I feel like he was just like, what is my plan? And I think once I got A5 and A4 in, he was just like, what am I doing? Now, he did get some counter going later, and that was on me. But I really just feel like for him, when he was looking at this, he's like, this is not what I expected playing in London. So.
Yeah, if you're thinking you're playing the London system and you see a position like this, nobody would have been able to guess that White started off with Bishop F4 on move number 2 of the game, trying to go for a London. Yeah, this is much more reminiscent of a King's Indian Defense type of pawn structure. As you mentioned, anybody who's familiar with it, usually the King's Indian Defense, White will get pawns up on E4, D4, and C4. Black will play E5, D6, then E5. White might play the move D5. But there are some differences at the same time compared to a normal King's Indian Defense structure, and that's specifically the presence of the pawns on C5 and especially the pawn on B4. In a King's Indian Defense, from White's perspective, one of their main plans is to play things like C5, B4, then C5, trying to stir up some counterplay over on the queenside part of the board, where they have generally speaking, where they have a bit of a space advantage based on their pawn being on D5. But in this version of the pawn structure, where we have our own pawns on C5 and B4, it's actually quite difficult for White to stir up counterplay on this queenside. They don't have B4 as an option. They don't have C5 as an option. They can play A3, which is about the only pawn break they can try to go for on that side of the board. But even if they play A3, we don't really need to react to it. We don't need to take the pawn. We can play A5 and kind of just reinforce the B4 pawn. And as you were mentioning there, Bill, one of the biggest difficulties, I'd say, for White in this type of pawn structure is the lack of pawn breaks that they have. And there's a very common saying, no pawn break, no plan. If you don't have an easy pawn break or a pawn break you can work towards in a certain position, then it can be very difficult to play that type of position, especially if the center is very locked up as we see here. So White's pawn break options are A3 and F4. Those are kind of the only two moves that they might consider in terms of kind of starting some conflict between the white and black pawns. A3 doesn't really do it a whole lot, as we just mentioned, and F4 is going to always be pretty risky, not only because it exposes the king a bit, but also because as soon as we capture the pawn, we wake up the bishop that's on the G7 square, and we also create the E4 pawn, becomes a weakness there, becomes a bit of a backwards pawn that White's going to have to babysit and defend. So if neither one of these pawn breaks are really all that useful for White, on the other side of the board, we can push our own A pawn up the board and gain more space, but we can also especially work towards our F5 pawn break. And this, again, for anybody who's played the King's Indian Defense before, they'll be very familiar with this pawn break. We play F5, we try to open up the king side, maybe we play F4 afterwards if they don't take it, maybe we do take on E4 depending on the circumstance, but ultimately our F5 pawn break is a lot easier for us to work towards and pull off compared to any of White's pawn breaks. And so for that reason, it is a lot tougher for White to play this kind of position compared to Black. And we're going to see exactly how that works out in the game. So if we're going to play F5, we're going to need to move the knight off of F6. However, we're not necessarily in a rush to do that just yet. Bill began with the move A5, gaining some space on the queenside part of the board first. Bishop D3, A4, A4. White ended up castling kingside. And now we have to figure out what we're going to do with the knight. Because we do want to move the knight and then work towards playing the pawn F5 pawn break. So essentially here we have two different options with the knight. We can go to H5 or to E8 in order to clear it off of the F6 square. And you ended up going to E8 in the game, Bill. But we did talk a bit in the past when we were first analyzing this game off video recording that knight H5 is another interesting option. So What was kind of going through your mind here in terms of deciding between these two moves?
Well, so one, I was happy with this position. You
Hmm?
know, when I played the King's Indian defense before, and I was younger, I was very aggressive, so I never would have done anything like an A5, A4. So I was really happy, and I knew I'm like I'm either playing knight H5 or I'm playing knight E8.
Hmm?
And my concern with playing knight H5 was that he would play G4, and then I'm gonna jump to knight to F4. I thought, okay, bishop is not that great, so he swaps that bishop, and he takes my knight, and now I've got a pawn, on F4. Now F5 may not be as good. That's kind of gone. And so I just started looking at that, and I'm like, I just don't like it. Like I wanted to be able to push F5, and if he takes, I take back, with my G pawn, or I'm playing, if he doesn't, I'm playing F4, and I'm locking up those dark squares. So I was like, that's what I want to do. And so that's why I played knight to E8. But, when you and I went over, it was like, knight H5 was the best move. I think that was one of the two inaccuracies chess.com gave me. So I don't think it was a terrible move, but yeah, knight H5 was absolutely better.
Yeah, so ultimately, knight e8 as you played in the game, perfectly fine move. You've got the right plan, you're working in the right direction. Knight h5 is just maybe a little more efficient way of doing things. And if white does go for g4, as you mentioned, knight f4, if white does make the trade, the biggest problem that white faces in this position is that, number one, they have this really lousy bishop on the d3 square. Uh, they've also exposed their king, so moves like h5 and maybe even still f5 are on the kind of table in terms of opening up the king side. And especially here, once we've gotten rid of the e5 pawn, we've opened up this bishop on g7 to be much more useful. The one downside to the position is that the bishop on d7 is in the way of where the knight would really like to be. But other than that, we're in pretty good shape. We can maybe play pawn to a3 to chip away at the diagonal, h5 to attack the king side, um, maybe still f5 at the right time, but move the bishop, get the knight in the game. Yeah, black is in very good shape here in a position like this. Now, that all being said, maybe white wouldn't play g4, but if white's not playing g4, then we can still pull the trigger on f5 pretty
Yeah.
quickly.
Yep.
So, anyways, though, in the game you went for knight e8, and you still have the correct plan here. Now, your opponent played g4. Anyways, whether your knight went to h5 or to e8, he still played g4 is the way it worked out. And so when he plays g4, at this point, even without the knight on h5, what was your thinking here?
So I'm going to play H5. I feel like he's weakened his king safety, right? So he's gambling because he's so concerned about me playing F5. He obviously probably knew something a little bit about the King's Indian, knowing F5's coming. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to see when you play knight E8 what you're going to do.
Right?
But yeah, but I think H5, I looked at it, I was like, H5 is good because if he takes, I'm taking on H3 with the bishop and I'm attacking, his rook. And I just felt that his king safety at that point is just going to be challenged. And if I don't play F5, he's got no real way of getting his, light squared bishop opened up. So that's why I decided to go that route.
Yeah, so I think that h5 is a really good kind of pivot that we make here, rather than really trying to just force through the f5 move, uh, which probably is not the best plan anymore. But now we have this new pawn break available with h5, and this is just much stronger at this point. As you mentioned, without playing f5, white also can't really wake up the bishop on d3, and we are able to still attack the opponent's king without helping our opponent, improve their bishop slightly in the process. So yeah, white's just in big trouble here. If they take on h5, we can take on h3 first. Uh, somehow try to swing the queen over to the g file would be made, or at least a dangerous attack here. We're attacking the rook on f1, of course, and white is just in a tough spot here. And if they don't take on h5, then it's pretty hard to defend these pawns anyways. g5 just loses h3 anyways here. In the game, your opponent played king h1, and that just allows you to take the pawn. So you captured 2 times on g4, and you're just up a pawn at this point. So you've won the pawn, he hits your bishop, you move the bishop backwards, and then he plays knight g5. And so now at this point in the game, we're up the pawn, so we're pretty happy about that, of course. And we're in what we would call kind of like a conversion phase for the most part. Conversion not meaning that the game is automatically over and we're just going to
Yep.
easily win the game, but more along the lines of, we know we're better and we're just trying to work our way forward using the advantage that we have at this point. So you went for queen f6 in the game, and what was kind of your plan going forward at this point?
I had looked at playing knight to f6, and that probably was the better move. But I was concerned about bishop g3, and what I should have just seen is with bishop g3, I can still just play knight to g4, and I can target, the knight that's on g5. By playing the queen there, I was like, okay, I'm still kind of hitting the pawn. I'm trying to get my queen maybe somewhere that's a little better, but I don't think that was the best move or the right move. I think playing knight to f6 was the best move. And then he surprised me with his next move, but he shouldn't have really. It made sense. But I was looking, this is also something I was talking with my friends about tonight too, is that sometimes we can get too focused on the side of the board we're attacking, and we miss, a potential move that our opponent might make. We're like, oh, I thought I had calculated it out, but I missed that.
Yeah, so I would say probably in this kind of position, we're up the pawn, which is obviously good. The biggest issue that we face at this point is not actually as much that white's about to attack us all that likely. I think we've got decent defense around the king, but I would kind of say that the biggest issue is just kind of the activity of the pieces here.
Which, yeah, fair.
And so if we play knight f6, as you mentioned, that gets the knight off the back rank. Knight d7 gets the other knight off the back rank. Queen f6 does get the queen off the back rank as well, but does also take up the square that maybe the knight would like to be on. So really here, we're up the pawn, we're in good shape. Our king is pretty safe, actually. And it's just now the time for us to start kind of moving the pieces forward and making small progress. So queen f6 is fine. Other moves are good as well. Your opponent played the move rook f1. You did go for knight to d7 to develop the knight. And here your opponent kind of lashes out here a bit. He goes for the move f4, and you are able to pick up another pawn.
Yep.
So,
and I saw that. I saw that he was going to play f4 by bringing the rook over. There's no other reason to. So he decided, I think this is where he got frustrated because he's like, I just don't have a plan. So I'm going to go for a pawn break, and I'm going to put pressure. And so when I was looking at this, I was like, okay, I'll play my knight to d7, because if he does that and I take, now I can attack on b2. And because I've already pushed my pawns as far as I have, and I have all that space, we're going to have to trade queens, and now I'm attacking over there. And I have enough defenders to hold on the king side.
Yeah, exactly. So we kind of, once he played rook f1, as you said, you're anticipating that he's going to play f4, or at least that's what he's clearly working towards. Kind of like how when you played knight e8, you're kind of telegraphing the f5 idea. He plays rook f1, he's telegraphing the f4 idea. But the nice thing from our perspective is that when he tries to pull it off right away, it has a drawback, because you are able to open up the diagonal and take the pawn on b2.
Yeah,
Maybe
he didn't see that. When I did that move, I could tell by the look on his face he just missed that.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe he should have tried b3 first or something like that. That way, when he does inevitably play f4, there's no pawn hanging. But even here, maybe you take the pawn, you open up the file for the rook, and then you just, you continue playing the game from here. And you're still up the pawn, and you're in good shape. But in the game, he does lash out a little bit, allows you to pick up a second pawn. And the really nice thing about this as well is not only are we picking up another pawn, but we're also pretty much guaranteeing that the queens are going to get traded. White can't go to d1 because of the bishop. And with that being the case, there's no way that white can avoid the trade of queens. So without the queens on the board, we are sitting here very nicely. Your opponent plays knight f3. And now we have to figure out kind of the next plan, or at least how to continue making progress here. Your opponent's trying to shuffle pieces towards the king side, understandably. But I really like what you did next here. So you went for the move b3. And what is the plan at this point with b3?
So I want to play on the queen side now. And the pressure's there. So by playing b3, I mean, if he allows me to take, I'm going to take. And the idea is to put pressure, and what I really want to do is trade pawns, and then I want to keep my a4 pawn on that side because my bishop is controlling the a1 square, and what I'm hoping to do is trade that pawn for a rook. That's what I want to do. So.
Yeah, so I say in plenty of other videos or speedrun episodes, when you're ahead material, especially if you're ahead a pawn, in this case we're ahead 2 pawns, which is extra good, but if you're ahead 1 pawn, you want to push the pawn where, you want to push on the side of the board where you have the extra pawn, try to create a pass pawn, and that's one of the best ways of just trying to make use of an extra pawn. And so with the move b3, if your opponent had taken the pawn, we actually have no intention of recapturing the pawn. We're just going to push to a3 and promote.
Exactly.
And yeah, this would be terrible for white. They'd pretty much have to sacrifice the bishop for the pawn, and then we're just up a piece with a very nice position. So instead of doing that, your opponent dropped the bishop back to b1 right away, defending the pawn. You played rook to b8. Other moves are good here too. You could take on a2 right away, but rook b8 is also perfectly good. They took you, and you take with the rook because, again, you want to keep the pawn on the a file, with the bishop controlling the promotion square. They hit your rook. You keep the pawn safe behind it. They go over here and aim at your bishop a little bit. And because we're ahead 2 pawns, you just go ahead and trade a pair of pieces, which is perfectly good. And then you pick up the pawn on c4. And so now we're ahead 3 pawns, and we are, we're in good shape. We're ahead 3 pawns. We're going to push the a pawn. You could also maybe have pushed the a pawn first.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think maybe the better move there would have just been to push the pawn.
Yeah, I suppose white could still play bishop b1, and maybe you'll still take the pawn at some point anyways. I think it all kind of ends up being pretty good. Now, actually, now that I'm saying that, there did end up being a tactical possibility in this position if we go a3 and the bishop goes back to b1. So if any viewers want to see if they can solve this position and figure out the tactic here, you can pause the video if you want. But the best move here, or at least one of the very good options, is to retreat the bishop to the f6 square, attacking the rook. But not only are we aiming at the rook, once the rook saves itself, we can now capture the bishop on b1, and then push the a pawn. And inevitably here, once we do promote the pawn, white is going to have to give the rook up for the pawn, or for the newly promoted queen. And now we are just ahead a minor piece along with the extra pawn. And this is pretty smooth sailing here. We just untangle the knights, trade pieces, and the extra piece for us should be very nice. So this might have been a little more efficient of a way of finishing things off, but the way you played in the game, you're still up 3 pawns and you're much better. So.
Well, and we were both under 5 minutes on our clock too. So.
Right. That definitely makes things a bit more complicated. No question about it. So we're up to 3 pawns, and the time is running a bit low. So it's always going to make life a little bit difficult. But let's see how things progress over the course of the next moves. So your opponent goes bishop d3, and here you went for rook to c1.
Did.
Looking to trade off a pair of rooks. This move is totally fine. I think, as we had discussed before, maybe rook to c3 and creating a little more of a threat here is another option. If white retreats the bishop to guard the knight, then we're right back to just promoting the pawn pretty much.
Yeah, that was a better move. At the time, I mean, we were low on time, and I thought to myself, okay, he needs both his rooks to create any kind of counter. True. So I'm just going to play my rook down, and we'll trade. I think the only thing I just missed is I should have pushed my pawn a little earlier, you know, because once you trade those rooks, like I just have a pawn with a bishop. And so, that was a good lesson for me. Like you said, I don't think there's anything wrong with the move, but I agree that rook c3 was a better move.
Right. So the difference between the two moves is that essentially when you play rook c3, you're forcing white to react, and you're not giving them a free move. Whereas when you go rook c1 and they trade the rooks, now they have a free move here. They can play, in the game they went for bishop to b5, but they can do something with their free move. Maybe pawn to e5 or something is also a move to consider. But if we go rook c3, there's not really a free move because we're the ones making threats in the first place. But
yeah,
you are still better after rook c1. Your opponent does go bishop to b5, and you focus now on pushing the pawn. If they do take the knight, you are just going to continue pushing, and the pawn is unstoppable. So white tries to bring the knight over to defend. You went for knight to b6 here. I think once again, maybe I would just push the pawn right away,
Yeah.
just to tie the knight down to the c2 square where it has to go to stop the pawn from promoting. And then maybe here, maybe we do now go knight b6 or knight e5, and inevitably we'll put the bishop there and promote. It's pretty hard for white to stop that from happening here. But okay, you went knight to b6 first. The knight went to c2, and then you went for bishop to b2. Could push the pawn first, could do bishop b2 first, doesn't really make a gigantic difference. Your opponent goes rook h3, and the rest of the game, you like you said, you were in time trouble, so the rest of the game we don't have the score for. But Bill did go on to win. I think that I think he was able to capture the pawn, if I remember correctly.
He was. I made a mistake here, and I actually ended up in the time scramble going down a piece, but I was able to win because he flagged. The one thing I would just say to everybody is this too: when you're playing an opponent that is a lot higher than you, and you have a better position, you can get nerves.
Mm-hmm.
You can be sitting there going, "Okay, I got this. Don't screw it up." And I think that's kind of what happened to me here. I thought I saw something, and I wasn't right, and I did lose my advantage. And I think one of the lessons that I got from talking to Dalton on this is just that you have to understand that you're playing your game and you're able to play your game. Because what my opponent was waiting for was for me to make a mistake, because he knew that he didn't have anything. And so I just would say to everybody that's out there is just remember when you're playing this, like, take a deep breath, even if you're in time control, and just say, like, I got this. Because I wish I had done that, and that's key. I had worked hard for this entire game to get this position, and then I made some mistakes and that I shouldn't have made, and I was fortunate to get the win. My opponent capitalized, and he just ran out of time. But it was a heck of a game, and what got me here was studying Dalton's course, on how to take on the London and the Binko Gambit course, and it definitely threw my opponent off, Dalton. So thanks for that.
Yeah, very welcome. And I would also say another kind of learning point here, especially at the tail end of the game, is even if we make a mistake in a game, like you said, you had this big advantage, you were growing it throughout the game, but then in time trouble and time pressure, when nerves kick in, we will potentially make mistakes, even if we'd rather avoid them. But if we do make a mistake, it doesn't necessarily mean that the game is automatically over or that the opponent just like wins on the spot, assuming that our mistake is not blundering a queen or walking into checkmate or something like that. But even if we make some kind of mistake, we want to try to kind of regroup ourselves for a moment. Okay, I made a mistake. Maybe I'm not as much better as I was before, but that doesn't mean that you're automatically worse or about to lose the game necessarily either. You want to just try to kind of keep your head in the game, just try to make the best moves possible going forward, even if you're not necessarily winning anymore. Because a lot of the times in chess, it's not the first mistake that loses you a game. It's usually the follow-up or snowball mistakes that happen afterwards. Even if we make a mistake and we're not winning anymore, maybe we went from being much better to being equal, or we went from being equal to a bit worse. If you keep making more mistakes after that, then it really starts tilting in the opponent's favor. But usually it's not the first mistake that will cause us to lose a game. It's usually going to be like the future mistakes after that. So if we make that first mistake, we want to try to regroup and still try to play your best and try to limit the future mistakes as best as we can. And so it sounds like you ended up losing a piece, but you still won the game because of some time pressure from the opponent. But you also kept the pressure on him. You didn't just resign once you were down the piece or something like that either. So you keep making him work for the win. He loses on time. He right now he has a very bad position, so he got pretty lucky to get his chances. But we're not, none of us are computers. We're all going to make mistakes inevitably at some point during a game. Very rare that people will play perfect games. This one was very, very good, but time trouble kicks in. A lot of people make mistakes in those scenarios, and we just have to continue fighting and try to pull out the win. And that's what you did. So yeah.
100%.
So, great game here, Bill. Thank you very much for doing this with me here to show to the viewers of the channel. Congratulations on the win here for sure, and hopefully you viewers have enjoyed this game.
Before you hit it, one thing for the viewers: make sure you hit that like button and you subscribe to Dalton's channel because he deserves it. He works hard for us, and let's give him that love.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Bill. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.